This is Hemant, and you're listening to the Friendly Atheist Podcast. If you like what you're listening to, please go to patreon.com/Friendly Atheist Podcast, and $5 a month will get you access to ad-free episodes of the show. Jessica's out of town this week, so I'm going solo, but I have an interview with someone you're really going to want to listen to. Dr. Randall Balmer holds the John Phillips Chair in Religion at Dartmouth College, Dartmouth's oldest endowed professorship. He previously taught as professor of American Religious History at Columbia University for 27 years. In his scholarship, Dr. Balmer focuses on Christianity's interrelationships with American politics. He's written several books on the topic, and his latest is Bad Faith: Race and the Rise of the Religious Right. We spoke about the real origins of the religious right, whether white evangelicals accept their own history, and if Democrats should use churches to their political advantage. Randall, thank you so much for chatting with me here. So I'll just get right into this. For all the culture war battles fought by the religious right, abortion always seems to be at the top of the list. But in a fairly viral 2014 Politico piece and in your new book, you write that this is part of their own mythology, this idea that they were inspired by Roe v. Wade to fight against abortion. But the reality, you said, is that that's actually a pivot. It was kind of a strategic move in a sense. So what was the actual motivator for the modern version of the religious right?
Sure. That's a great question. And I think I probably, along with everybody else, bought into what I now call the abortion myth. That is the fiction that evangelicals became politically active in the 1970s in direct response to the Roe v. Wade decision of 1973. And, this has become, sort of accepted wisdom for a lot of people. And in part because the leaders of this movement kept hammering away and saying, this is how it started. Well, as I began to do research in the matter, I found out that was not the case. And as you suggest, it was something very different. But if you don't mind, I'll just give you a little bit of evidence for demolishing what I call the abortion myth.
Yeah, that sounds great.
May I do that? Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, the abortion myth is the fiction that evangelicals became politically mobilized in the 1970s in response to Roe v. Wade. What I found instead is that I'll just give a little bit of the evidence. There's a whole lot. That's what the book is all about. One bit of evidence is that in 1968, Christianity Today, which is really the flagship magazine of evangelicalism, together with another evangelical group called the Christian Medical Society, conducted a conference over several days, inviting some of the heavyweight theologians from the evangelical world to discuss specifically the morality of abortion. And after several days of proceedings, they issued a statement saying, we really can't decide whether or not abortion is morally wrong, but we think it should be allowed. Two successive editors of that magazine, the founding editor and his successor, also issued equivocal statements on abortion. The Southern Baptist Convention, not exactly known as a redoubt of liberalism, in 1971 passed a resolution meeting in St. Louis, Missouri, calling for the legalization of abortion, which they reaffirmed in 1974, the year after Roe v. Wade, and again in 1976. When the ruling was handed down on January 22nd, 1973, W.A. Criswell, one of the most famous evangelicals of the 20th century, issued a statement applauding the Roe v. Wade decision. And finally, again, I could go on, but Jerry Falwell, by his own admission, did not preach his first anti-abortion sermon until February of 1978. That's more than 5 years after the Roe v. Wade decision. So all of this I call the abortion myth. This is the fiction that abortion was the motivating factor behind the mobilization of evangelicals in the 1970s.
I have actually seen books written by famous Christian apologists published in the late 1970s, maybe early 80s, where, yes, they were I'm not early 80s, but in the 70s, talking about abortion, but it wasn't as anti-abortion. That's not their stance. It was very much this is fine. And you could see in later editions of those books, those passages were taken out of it. Okay, so that's the myth, that they were always anti-abortion.
Right.
So what fueled that movement before that?
This is what I found fascinating. Again, and I've done, I spent more years researching this than I care to count. But what really happened was that the IRS, beginning in 1971, starts coming after evangelical schools, principally Bob Jones University in Greenville, South Carolina, but also other so-called segregation academies, that is, whites-only schools that were formed by churches, many of them, most of them perhaps, in order to evade desegregation of public schools. And as these schools began to apply to the IRS for tax exemption, various groups of parents, including principally a group of parents in Holmes County, Mississippi, said, this isn't right. And so they filed suit. Again, I can go through all the details here, but just to give you the broader outlines of the narrative, that suit eventually came before the district court for the District of Columbia. And on June 30th, 1971, that court issued a ruling that said, in effect, any institution that engages in racial segregation or racial discrimination is not, by definition, a charitable institution, and therefore it has no claims on tax-exempt status. And as the IRS in the 1970s began enforcing that decision, which, by the way, was also supported by Richard Nixon, of all people, as the IRS began to enforce that decision, that is what got the attention of people like Jerry Falwell, who had his own segregation academy in Lynchburg, Virginia, as well as, of course, Bob Jones University and these other places. That was the motivation for evangelical political activism in the 1970s. Had nothing to do with abortion.
They wanted to keep their whites-only schools, and they wanted tax-exempt status. They wanted to have their cake and eat it too. When it came to racism. Of course,
yeah. And the real I don't know, chicanery behind this is that Falwell, the mastermind behind this is Paul Weyrich, who's really the architect of the religious right. What he was able to do is to kind of twist that around to say, no, we're not defending racial segregation. We're defending religious freedom. Gee, does that sound familiar? Mm-hmm. This is what's going on right now with all the Hobby Lobby nonsense and things like that. We're defending our religious freedom, failing to acknowledge that tax exemption is a form of public subsidy, right? Mm-hmm. Tax-exempt organizations don't pay taxes. That, by definition, that's
right.
That's axiomatic.
And so taking it away, even for racial reasons, they're actually attacking your faith, is what he's getting.
That's what and that's very clever on their part to kind of twist that around. And you can see that this is the same rhetoric that's being used in the Hobby Lobby case and all these other, and now with the vaccine.
Well, vaccine exemptions, yeah. Religious freedom is really a cudgel for everything they want.
It is. You're absolutely right. Yeah. And I say this, by the way, I know this is the atheist group, and I'm not an atheist. I'm a person of faith. In fact, I'm an ordained Episcopal priest, so I'm not saying this in hostility to religion. But it's very clear that these folks are twisting this around to their own advantage and to do all sorts of nefarious things.
Now, one of the reasons for that pivot, then, one of the reasons Weyrich and others are saying this is about religious freedom, is because it's really hard to defend racism, the whites-only segregation academies, things like that. And yet, it seems like today, the conservative Christians, religious right, whatever group you want to call that, they don't seem to have any problem rallying behind, Trump bigotry, right, or even whether it's critical race theory or whatever you want to call it today. Right. It seems like it's pretty easy to pigeonhole them into racist things. So, it's not that they were ever pivoting away from racism. So, I guess one of the questions is, if it was so unpopular that they had to rebrand to get away from we're defending segregation to something else, why does it feel like they really haven't changed at all? Because if the argument is it's too unpopular, we cannot get behind that,
Right.
but they haven't gotten away from it.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. And I think the difference is Trump. I mean, Trump is the one who's kind of, in many ways, validated these prejudices and allowed them to flourish. And the other thing that I really picked up in the course of writing the book, and one of the reasons I did it was I was trying to explain to myself, how it is that 81% of white evangelicals, and again, the modifier white
Right.
is very important,
Right.
white evangelicals supported Donald Trump. This is a movement that's supposed to be about family values. I'm sorry, you can't make that. You can't make that case.
Right.
That support for Donald Trump is support for family values. You can't. There's no convoluted logic that would allow you to justify that. And what I began to see, and I guess in many ways the project started, although I've been working on the history of this for a long time, the immediate project started as a way to answer that 81% question. And what I determined, first of all, is that the 2016 election and support for Donald Trump allowed the religious right, people in this movement, to circle back to the foundational principle behind the movement itself, which was, there's no pretty way to say it, a defense of racial segregation, racism, to put it in the plainest terms.
But they would never acknowledge that. They would never say that's the reason.
They didn't until... they acknowledged it at least tacitly by supporting Trump in 2016.
Right.
But what I also saw is, what is the bridge between the origins of this movement in a defense of racism in the 1970s and Donald Trump in 2016? And again, this is a movement that brays about being for family values and all this stuff. And what I really saw, I think very clearly for the first time, I may have suspected it, but I saw very clearly that the bridge character here is Ronald Reagan. And I began to look a little bit more closely into Ronald Reagan's career. I mean, I remember his rise and his certainly his election and so forth, and being at the time utterly dumbfounded that evangelicals themselves would turn their back on one of their own. Jimmy Carter is a Baptist Sunday school teacher, born-again Christian, in favor of a divorced and remarried man who, as governor of California, had signed into law the most liberal abortion bill in the country. So I began to look a little bit more into Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan really began his political career in opposition to California's Rumford Fair Housing Act, which guaranteed equal access both in rental housing as well as in the purchase of real estate for everyone, right? Colorblind sort of thing. He opposed that. That's how he got started in politics. He was also an outspoken opponent of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Throughout his political campaigns, he frequently invoked the racially charged phrase, law and order. And nobody who remembers Reagan can forget his vile caricature of so-called welfare queens, women of color who supposedly live off the public dole in lives of luxury and so forth. He was never able to produce any of these welfare queens, but it didn't stop him from invoking them. And for me, the clincher and this, I still can't quite believe it, but I mean, it certainly happened. He opened his 1980 general election campaign for the presidency in, of all places, Philadelphia, Mississippi, at the Neshoba County Fair. This was the place where 16 summers earlier, members of the Ku Klux Klan, in collusion with the local sheriff's department, abducted, tortured, and murdered 3 civil rights workers. And Ronald Reagan, August 3rd, 1980, starts his general election campaign for the presidency in Philadelphia, Mississippi. And he was a master of symbolism. And yet, lest anyone miss his meaning, he declared on that occasion before this white audience, I believe in states' rights, which is the age-old segregationist battle cry. So for me, Ronald Reagan is really I mean, people talk about Reagan at the time. I remember, and again, I found this in the course of my research. He was a racist with a smile. That is to say,
Right.
his policies were not all that different from Barry Goldwater, for example, who, of course, Reagan supported in 1964. But but Goldwater always came off as angry and as combative. And Reagan, I mean, that was part of his charm, was that he was able to say and support, frankly, indefensible policies, but to do so in a kind of winsome way, in a way that Goldwater and others did not.
Not to change from that particular subject, but since we talk about the 81% of white evangelicals who voted for Trump in 2016, are you more surprised that so many of that particular group voted for Trump in 2016, even though he contradicts all of their stated values, or the fact that roughly the same number still voted for him in 2020?
No, in many ways, I'm still mystified by this because, I grew up in this world. I'm happy to acknowledge that. I'm not. It's part of who I am. It's part of my DNA. And one of the things that my father was an evangelical minister for 40 plus years. And one of the things my parents always drilled into me was, you never lie, you tell the truth. And, the Bible says something about false witness. According to independent sources, I think the figure is in Trump's 4 years as president, he made 30,500, is it 73? Something like that.
Something like that.
It's a big number. False and misleading statements. And to me, that was for me, and I'm being very serious about that. The notion of being honest and truthful was one of the foundations of being a believer, being a Christian. And, and then, of course, Trump, I guess, lately said something to the effect that he had done more for Christianity than Jesus, I guess. I don't know. I mean, and, it's
he didn't say he did good stuff.
It's blasphemous. Yeah, it's just, right. I mean, and for evangelicals, I mean, I can't really understand, but I guess, let's say we give them a pass for 2016, 81% of white evangelicals. Yeah. But to come back 4 years later, after all they'd seen in the course of Trump's presidency, and still pull the lever for Donald Trump is just unconscionable in my judgment.
I was surprised by that in part because I was hoping at least younger white evangelicals, excuse me, would pivot away. But it seems like they're pretty much on board, less so, but they're still not as distanced as I thought they would be.
Exactly. But I think if there is any hope for the movement and any hope for the future of evangelicalism, I think it probably will be with the younger generation, because they see things a little bit differently. And one of the things is that I think abortion is still important to a lot of them, frankly, but they don't see it as quite the central issue that their parents and their parents' generation did.
Let me go back to Bob Jones and that Segregation Academy. Now, this place famously did not end their no interracial dating rule until 2000 when George W. Bush was campaigning. But even that school's look, we screwed up. We're not doing that anymore. I feel like they've put out public statements to that effect, or at least, we were wrong in our interpretation of the Bible. But people like James Dobson, the people who were around when that pivot you talked about occurred, do they acknowledge the racist past of their own movement, or do they? Yeah, what's their take on it?
No, I don't think they do. I mean, I think, and I also think that I think some of them actually believe it. They actually believe the rhetoric that this movement has been spouting now for 40 years, that this was a movement that started in opposition to abortion. I think a lot of them actually do. I mean, Falwell made a statement shortly before his death that suggested to me that either he was believe me, I don't care for Jerry Falwell, but either he was an out-and-out sociopath, and I don't think he was. I mean, there's a lot not to like about Jerry Falwell, but the statements seem to suggest that he actually believed that abortion is what got him into the movement. So
he was around.
But and what I find so fascinating, I mentioned earlier that he didn't preach his first anti-abortion sermon until February of 1978, and he writes in one of his memoirs, he writes about his disbelief when the Roe v. Wade decision was handed down. Although he's writing this 14 years after the fact. So I think there's probably
a very selective memory right there. Because it seems today, okay, they shifted from out and out racism to we're firmly on this abortion train. I've seen them do similar pivots. I know you have too when it comes to fighting LGBTQ rights, things like that. Yeah. What do you think? I mean, it seems then theoretically possible to drive white evangelicals, to get them to rally behind a different cause that would actually, I don't know, benefit the world, benefit the country. Like, I could plausibly see a way to say white evangelicals are trying to protect the environment when it comes to climate change because this is the planet God gave us, or make an argument for equal rights for everyone.
Yeah.
I mean, within their context, it seems plausible. Yeah. It just doesn't seem likely. I'm wondering, do you think there is a cause that white evangelicals could rally behind that actually could garner the support of other groups of people? Because right now it seems like everything they do is in opposition to the progressive movement by and large. Right. Is there a way to get them to rally behind one of those other big central rallying?
It's a really good question. I hope you're right. And actually, one of the things, I'm going to wave my book here if I could. One of the things
we're going to do audio only, but I will plug that book.
Yeah. One of the things I try to do in the book is to say, let's look at your own history. I'm talking to evangelicals here. You look back into the 19th and even in the early 20th century, evangelicals were very much involved in issues and causes that, like you're talking about, I think most people today would understand that opposition to slavery is, probably a pretty good thing to list on your resume, right? I oppose slavery. I mean, most people would say that. No, I'm willing to acknowledge that some Southern theologians defended slavery, and they did so or tried to do so on biblical grounds. I'm not going to try to whitewash that, if you'll allow me to use that word. 19th century evangelicals supported women's rights, women's equality, even voting rights, which was a radical idea in the 19th century. I think that's a pretty good cause that could be resurrected.
Is the reason that hasn't happened yet a lack of a push for that from the movement's leaders? Is it just a generational thing? We're waiting for new people and new blood and new causes to take a hold? Or is it something else? Because, I don't know if the right wing, the Trump side, just basically co-opted that entire movement now. So it's not even possible. I don't know.
I fear that that's the case, that it has been co-opted. And I do blame the leadership. I think, Franklin Graham, I actually did a PBS documentary about his father. I admired his father very much. He wasn't perfect, but none of us is perfect. I understand that. I think Franklin Graham has done untold damage to evangelicalism, but also to the faith itself, in kind of slobbering all over Donald Trump and other things. Jerry Falwell Jr., Tony Perkins, these people cavorting with the Ku Klux Klan. In case of Perkins, for example, these people have done untold damage. So I guess the corollary of your question is there any hope? Is there any hope that evangelicals will be able to reclaim their own history, which I consider a noble history of concern for those that Jesus called the least of these? If you look in the 19th century, they were involved in some of the issues I talked about, but also prison reform, very much in support of public education, known as common schools in the 19th century. Those were all the evangelical concerns that would be worthy of picking up once again. Will that happen? I think if there's any hope, it does lie with the younger generation. I don't see any leadership in the older generation that is going to bring evangelicals back to their own roots, or even to the New Testament. I mean, Jesus is pretty clear in Matthew 25 what the application of a believer is, and it doesn't in any way resemble the agenda of the religious right.
When you have spoken about your book, Bad Faith, to a primarily evangelical audience, and you tell them about the history we are talking about here, do they believe you?
I don't know if they do or not. Again, that's one of the reasons I wrote them. I mean, you mentioned earlier that I did a Politico article in 2014, which I, did some of the arguments, or at least the core of the argument. But one of the reasons I wanted to write this book was to be able to, first of all, add things that I'd found since I wrote that article. And by the way, Politico once told me that it was their most popular article they'd ever had published. I'm sure that's no longer true, but at one time it was.
Well, I remember when it came out and it was making waves, not because those of us who followed the movement were surprised by it, but because it's not often you have it laid out by a historian in a way that's very blunt. Yeah. About what that past was. So it wouldn't surprise me that it was as popular as it was.
It was pretty popular. But, I wanted to write it. And the other thing is that the book includes all the footnotes. And also, I mean, anybody wants to retrace my steps, please go at it. But I could say without fear of contradiction that this is a movement that did not begin with opposition to abortion. It began in defense of racial segregation. So getting back.
So do younger Christians, I mean, at least younger white evangelicals, are they more likely to believe you?
I haven't had a whole lot of audiences, in part because of COVID, I'm sure, but also because I'm probably not on the A list for some of these audiences. I mean, I think once I lay it out, any people who are reasonable and not ideologically blinded, I'll say, and I know that ideological blindness goes on both sides of the spectrum. I understand that, but they certainly understand it. And again, I think more important to me as a historian is that nobody's refuted it. I mean, it's one thing to say, I don't think you're right. Well, fine, I'm willing to listen to that. You can do that. But show me where I'm wrong is another question. And, again, nobody's shown me that.
I'm especially curious if anyone who accepts the history of the religious right as you lay it out notices the parallels to what today's religious right is doing when it comes to critical race theory or Black Lives Matter or things like that. Right. And you're retracing those steps, right? And I wonder how many of those right-wing Christians acknowledge that.
I think some people, understand the connection. And again, one of the reasons I wrote the book also was to make that connection more explicit and to say, and this was, as I said earlier, this was a way for me to understand it for myself, because on the face of it, Donald Trump? I mean, Ted Cruz is equally loathsome in my judgment for various reasons, but at least there would be some logic to evangelical support for Ted Cruz or somebody like that.
I feel like one of the lasting images of Donald Trump will always be just holding a Bible in front of a church that
upside down.
Didn't even want him, that didn't even want him there, that he clearly hadn't read. There was one interesting story you tell. And I don't want to give away anything here, but when we were talking about Bob Jones University and their segregationist past, but there's a link between them and the former Supreme Court Chief Justice William Rehnquist. Can you tell that story briefly?
Yeah, and I just kind of laid it out there. I didn't want to bludgeon in readers with it, but it's worth noting. So what happened? So first of all, Bob Jones University, after years of warnings, loses its tax-exempt status on January 19th, 1976. Well, they file suit. It goes through the courts and so forth. Finally, up to the Supreme Court in the fall of 1982. And, of course, Ronald Reagan is president by then. And initially, the Reagan administration announced that they would support Bob Jones in their arguments before the Supreme Court, that Bob Jones University should be allowed to keep both its tax-exempt status as well as its racially discriminatory policies. The outcry was so great that the Reagan administration backed away from that. The case went before the court without the Solicitor General arguing on behalf of Bob Jones University. And the ruling was handed down in May of 1983. And it was an 8-1 ruling against Bob Jones University.
Meaning they cannot keep their tax-exempt status if they want to maintain segregation.
Exactly. The sole dissenter was Associate Justice William Rehnquist, the same man Ronald Reagan elevated to Chief Justice of the Supreme Court a couple of years later. So, yes, I just put that in there as sort of a postscript, and I'll let people interpret that for themselves.
I have one question. I don't mean to put you on a spot because you're a historian and this is a story that happened this week, but I'm curious to hear your take on it. When Trump was in office, he spent several years saying, I've eliminated the Johnson Amendment, which he never did. But that he was saying, if you're a pastor and you want to endorse a candidate from your pulpit, you can do it and your tax exempt status is not going to be in jeopardy. That's what he kept claiming he did. Right. That rule was never abolished, but the IRS has not enforced it. But last week in the Virginia gubernatorial race, Kamala Harris made a video that is now being shown in, I think I heard 300 predominantly black churches through Virginia, encouraging people to souls to the polls, vote for Terry McAuliffe, the Democrat, for governor. And there have been a number of atheist groups that have spoken out and said, we oppose that too on principle. And again, my first take when I heard that was, I'm fine with it, mostly because if Republicans are playing that game and they're not getting punished for playing politics from the pulpit, it seems to me unilateral disarmament for Democrats to say, well, we're not going to do it. That's the wrong thing to do. I'm like, hey, get every politician to walk into every progressive, mainstream, not evangelical church and say, hey, we need you, vote for our side. I'm just kind of curious because when it comes to playing the religious fight, the religious freedom argument, it always seems to come from the right. And I guess the question I'm asking in a broad sense is, do you think progressive Christians, progressive religious people should basically fight fire with fire on that front? Or do you think this is a more harmful thing everyone should get away from? But realistically, I don't think that's going to happen. My argument here is, look, if they're not enforcing the law, Democrats need to play the game. But this has been a source of argument. I don't know if you have a take on that. Yeah,
it's tough. Actually, the previous book, I actually published 2 books this year. The one I published in February is called Solemn Reverence. It's about the separation of church and state in American life, a very slim book as well. And I think the First Amendment is the best thing that's ever happened to America. I mean, I think Ken Burns talks about national parks as America's best idea. I think America's best idea is the First Amendment and the separation of church and state. And I'm prepared to go to the wall on that one because I think it is actually good for a religion because it's set up a kind of free marketplace where there's a lot of competition in this marketplace. But it's also good for the state and good for the polity because it keeps religion out of politics. For the most part. Now, have people violated that? Absolutely. There's no question about that. And frankly, black churches has been one of the venues where that line of separation is probably fuzzier than many other places. So fire with fire, yeah, I suppose you're right. I think probably in the short term that's defensible, but I think keeping the larger principle of separation of these two entities is probably good, again, both for the state as well as for the faith itself. So I think one of the real grand experiments in America has been the idea that you would construct a government, construct a society without the interlocking infrastructure of religion. And I think this has been a wonderful idea. It's worked very well for over 200 years, which is not to say there haven't been violations here and there. That's part of the thing I addressed in that book. But I think overall it's a very good idea. And what you talked about with Kamala Harris, I think, it does disturb me a little bit. I think it's traversing that line of separation. And if we do that, then, all bets are off. And I think that's not a good idea.
Fair enough. Thank you so much, Dr. Randall Balmer. The book is Bad Faith, Race and the Rise of the Religious Right. I appreciate you taking your time here.
My pleasure. Enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.